Welcome back. I'm Angelica Reyes, team leader of the Reyes Team here at eXp Realty. And I'm here with
Sam Britt from iServe Residential Lending.
And we're excited to bring the next topic in our series to you, our viewers. So Sam, the next topic that I want to talk about is contingencies. And once an offer is accepted, what are the next steps for a home buyer?
Well, I'm glad you asked. All right, so the way it works is once you guys have an accepted offer, the real estate agent will have a transaction coordinator typically that will send it over to our side of the transaction, which is the mortgage side. We will then do what's called order the disclosures from the title company and get all the fees and gather that together and do what we call a disclosure to the buyers so that they can sign those disclosures. Those disclosures are basically everything that was discussed before they got into contract, varying from the loan amount, the down payment, interest rate, everything that will incur with that particular home loan that was discussed in the pre-approval process.
So that would be, your payments, for example, would be
mortgage payments, what they're expected to bring for cash to close on the transaction, and of course, when their actual closing date is as well.
Yeah. So a part of that loan contingency that I did want to bring up was the appraisal. The appraisal process and what that looks like. So in that closing disclosure, what do you do?
So I'm glad you asked that question. So the way it works with appraisals is you've got two big main topics of being able to order an appraisal, right? If it's a conventional home loan, which we'll get into that segment later, you can order the appraisal immediately as soon as you go into contract. But if it's an FHA home loan, you can't order it until we have what's called the case number. A case number is basically where in the transaction in the beginning when we're ordering the disclosures, we're also ordering a case number, which is an assignment from an FHA home loan that allows us to order the appraisal within the process, right? That happens within the first 48 to 72 hours, you're going into contract and you get your disclosures.
So let's kind of explain to our viewers what an appraisal is. And is it the same thing as an inspection? Because that's a really common question.
Yeah, okay, let's clear that up right now. So the difference between an appraisal and an inspection is obviously an appraisal is something that protects the home buyer and us, the bank. Basically, and what we're doing in that scenario is we're making sure that whatever you're in contract for, the value's coming in at least at that value, right? Because you don't want somebody buying a house underwater, otherwise you're gonna have to renegotiate it. What it does is it also goes through some basic requirements that you have to be able to pass the inspection. So there is an appraiser that will go out and assess the property's condition. So you still have conditions that you have to meet. For example, if there's peeling paint or if there's a hole in the wall, if some of the electrical isn't working, that all needs to be addressed. The appraiser is going to call that out to make sure that basically the home buyer is not buying a lemon. It's not as in-depth as you're talking about to an inspection that you're speaking of, which would be like a home inspection. But basically, it covers the bank and the buyer mainly on the purpose of the value of the home.
One of the things that I do want to just break down and make sure that all our viewers understand is a contingency. So contingencies are timeframes that you need to stick to according to your contract. So you'll have several contingencies in the contract. For example, the loan contingency, which is a process that you sit down with your lender and discuss everything that needs to be, any actions that need to be taken to make sure your loan is approved. One of the other contingencies is inspections. So that'll be an opportunity for you to inspect the home, make sure that you're happy with the condition, and that if there's any issues that need to be addressed with the home seller, they can do that at that time. Now, one of the things I do want to jump back into is talking about closing costs. When a buyer sits down with you and discusses what fees they need to bring, what are some of those closing cost fees that they can expect to pay for when they get ready to close on their home?
Well, of course, closing costs, when we do the initial disclosures, it basically consists of any sort of bank fees such as underwriting, processing fees, of course, an appraisal fee, any inspections that are elected on the contract. So if your buyer had elected for a home inspection, pest inspection, any of that stuff, these are fees that are expected to be paid at closing. Same thing with title fees. Title fees are something that you have to be expected to pay as well, and that obviously is a background check on the property, what the seller was doing with property prior, if there's any liens on the property. It's a conglomerate of fees that are basically expected to be paid, I would say 48 hours before an actual closing date, traditionally.
Yeah, and I do want to mention that a lot of these fees are negotiable when you sit down with your real estate agent to negotiate the terms of your offer. So it doesn't necessarily mean that every single fee is always going to be paid by the buyer or always going to be paid by the seller. Especially in the markets that are changing,
Correct.
we do see it semi-shifting from one person typically paying for it. Well, not really typically, but in terms of negotiations, paying for that fee versus like in a different market, you see that maybe the other party would more likely pay for those fees.
I agree.
So
I think that's where it's very key to have a real estate agent like yourself that is, in tune to what the market changes are doing.
Right.
As you know, for example, transfer tax. Transfer tax is something that the county will charge the seller for selling the house. You're expected to have that paid for during the transaction. Well, in our market, traditionally, that would always be split between the buyer and the seller. But because we're in such a short housing situation, what's happening?
yeah, we sometimes will see that in instances where there's a shortage of homes, the buyers may opt into paying some of those fees.
Just to entice the seller, correct?
Yeah, to make their offer more appealing. So we do see that, depending on different markets. So it's really important to be with an experienced team that knows and understands what will make your offer stronger.
Correct.
And getting it accepted.
Correct.
So.
I do know when we're ordering, the disclosures to send out to the buyers to be able to sign their paperwork, I know there's a time frame for appraisals. Typically, this is one of the biggest hot points as a mortgage lender that we have to adhere to for the real estate agent. And typically, what is that contingency? What is expected from that?
Well, again, in different markets, when we do have appraisers available, it seems like the timeframes are a little bit shorter, but when we have a high demand for them, it might extend a couple of weeks. But we definitely need to make sure that the appraisal is completed back in the hands of the buyer so they know what to do and if they want to go ahead and move forward on the purchase, and make sure that they're able to close on time. So that's
you guys. So typically an appraisal turn time in our market right now is anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks. That's why it's very critical that the mortgage loan officer orders that appraisal within the first 48 to 72 hours they receive the contract from the real estate agent.
Mm-hmm. So one of the other questions that I actually receive quite a bit is when we are starting the process, there's good faith money that we actually will include in our offer. And that's also
EMD.
So it's also referred to earnest money deposit. So Sam, tell us a little bit about, like, once an offer is accepted, send you the offer and we start that process, what happens with that earnest money and how's it,
Okay, well, let's start with what an earnest money deposit is. Typically, you're going to see it on the contract. It's your good faith money that goes to title. You're basically telling the seller, in other words, hey, Mr. Seller, I'm in love with this property. I want to purchase this home. Here's my $1,000. That's typically what it is in this market. And I'm going to lock this transaction up. So when you're searching for homes and you see homes that say pending, that's basically what that is that's your good faith money locking up the transaction, saying, hey, Mr. Seller, I'm in love with it. I'm going to close on this based off whatever the closing date is you agreed upon with the seller. That $1,000 goes to the title company and it's held in their trust account. And that goes towards your closing costs. So for example, if you had $15,000 in closing fees, that $1,000 that you fronted, so to speak, will go and be applied towards your $15,000. That's initially what an earnest money deposit is, and I believe it's due within the first 24 hours.
Yes, so within one business day, we want to make sure that it's deposited to the title company. So one important factor that I do want to bring up is in our contract there is a contingency regarding the earnest money deposit. If you're going to move forward with a transaction, you have several contingencies. So basically timeframes that a buyer has to stick to. Once those timeframes have exceeded, if you decide to cancel the contract or back out of the contract, there is a risk of you possibly losing the earnest money. Why is that? Well, you've taken the home off the property or off the market for the seller to try and sell and move forward on their sale. So a lot of times that will be released back to the seller to compensate them for their time that they've removed that property. So that's just really important tip to kind of keep in the back of your mind. When you're going through the process, stick with your lenders, stick with your realtor, make sure that you're sticking to those time frames so you don't run into that scenario where you do lose your earnest money.
And don't worry, guys, we'll protect you on that. We'll tell you exactly how to lead on that. The only time you would really lose your earnest money deposit is if you, the buyer, decide to back out for any personal reasons. If, for example, you were approved and then for some odd reason you were unapproved from some unforeseen circumstance, you are allowed your earnest money back because it's something you couldn't control. The bottom line is, if you want to get that earnest money back, it better be for some other reasons, because once you front that money up, it's go time. You're getting ready to get a house here in 30 days.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was a lot of great information. I always love sitting down chatting with you and providing this information back to our viewers.
Absolutely. Remember, guys, we're always here for anything you guys have questions on. I know this was a lot, and if you're a first-time home buyer, you're going like, I have no clue what you were talking about. But remember, we're only a phone call away, and we can always take one-on-one time to help you out with those questions.
So stay tuned for all our future episodes, and we look forward to helping you achieve the dream of homeownership.
Thanks, guys.